The Gallatin River did not care if a person lived or died. It only cared about flowing, cold and relentless. From the high peaks down to the valley where the white men dug for gold and the native tribes watched their hunting grounds shrink day by day. Willa Hart respected the river. She feared it, too, in the way a sensible woman feared a wild stallion that could never truly be broken. But she never turned her back on it. It was late October in the year 1878. The air in the canyon already carried the sharp, metallic tang of coming snow. The wind rushed down through the pines, singing a low, mournful song that Willa had listened to every night for 19 years. She stood outside the rough-hewn cabin her father had built 2 decades ago, her breath puffing out in white clouds against the gray morning light. Willa was 19 years old, an age when most women in the territory were bouncing a second child on their hip or burying a first husband. But Willa was not like the women in the settlement 10 miles downriver. She did not wear calico dresses with lace at the collar, and she did not attend the Sunday socials where mothers paraded their daughters before the miners and merchants. Willa wore her father's old trousers, cut down and hemmed with sinew, and a heavy wool coat that smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. She lifted the axe, feeling the familiar weight of the hickory handle in her palms. With a sharp exhale, she brought it down. The blade bit deep into the pine logs, splitting it clean with a satisfying crack. This was her life. Chop, split, stack, bundle. The rhythm of survival. Her father, a trapper from Kentucky who had come west seeking silence rather than fortune, had raised her to know the value of a cord of wood. He had died 3 years ago, his lungs taken by a fever that the winter winds refused to blow away. Her mother, a woman of the Salish people whose name meant mourning dove, had passed long before that, leaving Willa with high cheekbones, eyes the color of dark river water, and a soul that felt forever split down the middle. To the people in the town, she was a half-breed curiosity, a savage who could read the Bible. To the tribe up in the mountains, she was a reminder of a daughter who had walked away to live in a square wooden box with a white man. Willa belonged to the canyon and to the river. She gathered the split logs, their fresh scent sharp in her nose, and began to stack them onto the small hand cart she used to drag her wares down to the riverbank. It was hard work that broadened her shoulders and calloused her hands, but it kept her belly full. The miners heading up toward the claims in the high country needed fuel. The few homesteaders trying to scratch a living out of the rocky soil needed kindling. Even the big plantation house 5 miles south sent a wagon once a month. Willa dragged the cart over the uneven ground, the wooden wheels groaning in protest. At the river's edge, she had a small landing, barely more than a flat stretch of mud and stone where she stacked her bundles. A sign, painted in tar on a flat board, read, "Wood for sale, 50 cents a bundle." She sat on a large, flat rock to wait. Waiting was part of the trade. Sometimes she waited hours, sometimes days. A group of 3 riders appeared on the trail that ran parallel to the water. They were miners, their clothes stiff with mud and grease, their faces hidden behind beards that looked like bird nests. Willa stiffened. She moved her hand subtly to her belt, where a hunting knife sat in a leather sheath. The lead rider pulled his horse up. He was a big man with a red nose and eyes that roamed over Willa like hands. "Well now," the man drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "If it isn't the river girl, still chopping wood all by your lonesome." Willa did not smile. She kept her chin high. "Wood is 50 cents a bundle. If you are not buying, keep riding." The men laughed, a harsh sound that startled a crow from a nearby pine. "Feisty," the second man said. "I hear she sleeps with that axe. I hear no man has ever gotten close enough to find out if she is as warm as that firewood she sells." "A waste," the first man muttered, eyeing the curve of her waist beneath the heavy coat. "A pretty thing like you, living like a hermit. You need a man to keep you warm. Little virgin, that wood won't hug you back." "The wood pays for my flour and coffee," Willa said, her voice steady despite the thumping of her heart against her ribs. "And the wood does not smell like cheap whiskey. Buy or leave." The leader glared at her for a long moment. perhaps weighing the trouble against the pleasure. But something in Willa's dark eyes, or perhaps the hand resting casually near the knife, made him scoff. He kicked his horse. "Come on, boys. She is too sour for my taste anyway." They rode on, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of unwashed bodies. Willa let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. This was the dance. They pushed. She held firm. They mocked her solitude, called her virgin like it was an insult rather than a fact. And she endured it. She had to. This strip of land, this cabin, was all she had. Later that afternoon, the wind changed. The sky turned a bruised purple over the peaks of the Gallatin Range. Willa was down by the water again, securing a stack of wood onto a small, flat-bottomed skiff she used to ferry bundles across to the far bank for the trappers who came down the other side. The current was fierce today. The autumn rains had swollen the river, turning it gray and frothy. She did not hear him approach. Most men moved through the woods with the grace of a falling tree, breaking twigs and stomping boots. This man moved like smoke. One moment the tree line was empty. The next, he was standing there, leaning against a Douglas fir, watching her. Willa spun around, gasping, nearly dropping a log. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, dressed in buckskins that had seen years of grease and blood. A buffalo robe was draped over one shoulder, and a Hawken rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm. He looked to be past 30, his face weathered by sun and wind into the texture of old saddle leather. A scar ran from his left temple down into his beard, white and jagged against the tan skin. But it was his eyes that held her. They were blue, a startling, pale blue like the center of a glacier, and they were watching her with an intensity that was entirely different from the miners. He was not undressing her. He was studying her, the way a wolf studies a deer, not necessarily to kill it, but to understand what it is. "You are going to lose that boat if you tie the knot that way," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. Willa bristled. "I have tied this boat 1,000 times. It holds." "The river is rising," the stranger said. He pushed off the tree and walked toward her. He moved with a rolling gait, slow but powerful. "Current is faster than it looks. That hitch will slip in an hour." "I did not ask for your help," Willa snapped, stepping back to put the boat between them. The man stopped 10 feet away. He raised his empty hands, showing palms calloused and stained with walnut dye. "Just trading words. Girl, I have got pelts to take to town. Saw you struggling." "I'm not struggling," Willa lied. She was exhausted. Her back ached, and her hands were numb from the icy water. She turned back to the boat, determined to prove him wrong. She grabbed the heavy rope, intending to cinch it tighter, but as she leaned out over the water, her boot found a patch of slick, wet clay. It happened in a heartbeat. Her foot slid. Her weight shifted too far forward. The river, hungry and waiting, seemed to reach up for her. She flailed, her arms pinwheeling, tilting dangerously toward the churning gray water that would freeze the breath in her lungs in seconds. She expected the cold shock. Instead, she felt heat, rough, hard heat. A hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers sinking into the thick wool of her coat with the strength of an iron trap. She was yanked back with such force that the air left her chest. She collided with a solid wall of chest and buckskin. Willa gasped. Looking up, she was pressed against the stranger. He had moved with a speed that defied his size. He held her steady, his boots planted firm in the mud, anchoring them both against the pull of the gravity and the river. For a moment, neither of them moved. Willa could smell him pine resin, horse sweat, rain, and tobacco. It had a wild scent, but was clean. His face was inches from hers. Up close, the scar on his cheek looked old, a memory of violence long survived. He was the first man to touch her in 3 years. Since her father died, no one had laid a hand on her except to shove past her in a store. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear of the fall, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity of another human being. She waited for him to make a move, to tighten his grip, to leer, to ask for payment for the rescue. He did none of those things. He simply stood her upright, steadying her until she found her footing. And then he let go. He stepped back immediately, giving her space. "Careful," he said. "The Gallatin takes what it wants." Willa smoothed her coat, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw that the blue eyes were not mocking. They were guarded. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling stiff on her tongue. "My name is Boone," he said. "Boone Carver." Willa nodded. She had heard the name, the mountain man who lived up near the timberline. People said he was a hermit who preferred the company of bears to Christians. They said he had killed a man in Wyoming, or maybe Colorado. "Willa Hart?" she replied. Boone nodded at the stack of wood. "You cut all this?" "I did." "Good clean cuts," he murmured, glancing at the bundle ends. "You know how to handle an axe." It was a compliment, a genuine one. Willa felt a strange warmth flush through her cheeks, unrelated to the cold wind. "It is my trade." Boone looked out at the river, his expression darkening. The silence stretched between them, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence she felt when the townspeople stared at her. It was a companionable silence, the kind two hunters share when watching the same trail. "You should sell what you can." "Willa Hart," Boone said quietly. "Sell it all and hide the money." Willa frowned. "Why?" He turned his gaze back to her. "I was in town yesterday. At the trading post, there is a man named Silas Crowder. He represents a combine from the east, Northern Timber and Rail." Willa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "I have seen his men surveying the lower valley." "They are not just surveying anymore," Boone said. "I heard them talking. They want the water rights. All of them. They plan to build a dam right here, where the canyon narrows. A dam to power a sawmill big enough to chew up this whole forest in 5 years. Willa stared at him. "A dam, but that would flood the lowlands. It would flood my cabin." "It would," Boone confirmed. "And it would dry up the run for the tribe upstream. Crowder has a pocket full of government contracts and a bag full of gold. He intends to buy everyone out. Those who do not sell." He trailed off, his eyes hard. "Well, accidents happen in the West." Willa looked around. She looked at the cabin her father had built log by log, chinking the gaps with mud he had mixed with his own hands. She looked at the trees she knew by name, the ancient ponderosa pines that had stood watch over her mother's grave on the ridge. This valley was not just land, it was her history. It was the only place in the world where she was not a half-breed outcast, but simply Willa. Her hand curled into a fist at her side, her nails digging into her palm through the wool of her gloves. "This is my land," she said, her voice low and fierce. "My father filed the claim. I have the papers." Boone looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something like admiration crossed his stoic face. He saw the set of her jaw, the fire in her dark eyes. He saw a woman who was standing alone against an avalanche and refusing to move. "Paper burns. Willa," Boone said softly. "And men like Crowder do not care about claims written by dead men. Let them come," she said. "I do not sell to strangers." Boone adjusted the pack on his shoulder. He looked at the fragile girl standing beside the roaring river, surrounded by her bundles of wood. She looked small against the backdrop of the looming mountains and the darkening sky. A gust of wind blew a strand of black hair across her face, and she brushed it away impatiently. She was a creature of the wild, just as he was. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of a trapped animal that has decided to stop running and start fighting. "Watch your back. Willa Hart," Boone said. He tipped his head slightly, a gesture of respect he had not given to a human being in a long time. "The storm is coming, and it is not just snow." He turned and walked away, moving upstream along the bank, disappearing into the shadows of the spruce trees as quickly as he had arrived. Willa stood alone on the bank. The river rushed past her feet, loud and violent, carrying the melted snow from the high peaks. She reached down and picked up a heavy piece of oak firewood. She hefted it onto her shoulder, feeling the rough bark bite into her neck. It was heavy. It was a burden, but it was hers. She looked at the water. Behind her lay the dark, silent forest. Before her lay the dangerous current. She was the girl who sold wood to survive. But as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from the gray sky, Willa knew one thing with absolute certainty. She might sell wood to feed her body, but she would never sell this land. It was her heart, and her heart was not for sale. The wind howled, signaling the beginning of a long, hard winter. Willa turned and walked back toward her cabin, her boots leaving deep prints in the freezing mud, each step a silent declaration of war against the world that wanted to erase her. The storm arrived 3 hours after sunset, tearing down the valley like a beast that had been starved for a month. It was not snow, not yet, but a cold, driving rain that turned the earth into a slick, black soup and threatened to wash the world clean of anything not rooted in stone. Willa Hart was outside in the thick of it. The wind howled through the canyon, bending the tops of the lodgepole pines until they groaned in protest. The river, already swollen, roared with a new violence, lapping hungrily at the muddy bank where her livelihood sat stacked in neat cords. She fought with a heavy canvas tarp, her fingers numb and clumsy inside soaked leather gloves. The wind caught the corner of the fabric, snapping it like a whip. Willa gritted her teeth, planting her boots deep in the mud, leaning her entire weight against the gale. If the wood got soaked through, it would rot before it dried. If the river rose another foot, it would carry the bundles away to the Missouri. "Hold," she commanded the canvas, her voice lost instantly in the cacophony of the storm. She wrestled the rope, trying to lash it to the iron stake she had driven into the ground. The wet hemp was slippery, and her hands were shaking from the cold. The wind surged again, tearing the rope from her grasp. The tarp flapped wildly, threatening to take flight and leave her wood exposed to the deluge. Willa lunged for the flying rope, stumbling on a slick rock. She braced herself for the fall, for the mud to coat her face, but a shadow moved in the periphery of her vision. A large hand intercepted the flailing rope. Boone Carver stepped out of the driving rain as if he were part of the storm itself. He did not say a word. He did not look at her. He simply grabbed the rope, hauled the tarp down tight over the wood with a single, powerful motion, and held it there. His muscles bunched beneath his soaked buckskin coat as he fought the wind, turning his broad back to the gale to create a shield for the work. Willa scrambled to the other side of the stack. She understood the rhythm immediately. While he held the tension, she quickly looped her end of the rope around the stake, tying a double hitch that would hold against anything short of a tornado. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, moving from stack to stack. Boone used his weight to suppress the flapping canvas. Willa used her deft fingers to secure the knots. They were a team forged by necessity. Two solitary creatures recognizing that, on a night like this, solitude meant failure. When the last knot was tied, Willa leaned back against the woodpile, gasping for breath. Rainwater streamed down her face, plastering her black hair to her skull. She looked at Boone. He stood 5 feet away, water dripping from the brim of his hat, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. "You should go inside," he said, his voice barely audible over the river. "Get warm." "You are wet through," Willa shouted back. "The fire is lit." It was an offer of shelter, rare and dangerous for a woman living alone, but he shook his head. "I have a camp in the tree line. Better I stay there." He turned before she could argue, disappearing into the wall of rain. Willa watched the darkness where he had vanished, feeling a strange emptiness in her chest. She shivered, not just from the cold, and turned back to her cabin. The morning broke gray and sullen. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world that smelled of wet pine needles and ozone. Fog clung to the surface of the river, thick and white, obscuring the far bank. Willa was up before dawn, boiling coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. She sat on her porch, sharpening her axe with a whetstone. The rhythmic shh sound the only noise in the valley. The river had crested just inches below her wood stacks. The tarps had held. At 8 o'clock, the sound of hoofbeats broke the morning stillness. Willa stood up slowly, the whetstone still in her hand. She watched as 4 riders emerged from the fog on the trail leading from the town. They were not miners this time. Miners rode mules or exhausted nags. These men rode tall, grain-fed geldings with coats that gleamed even in the dull light. In the lead was a man Willa recognized, though she had never spoken to him. Silas Crowder. He was a man who looked out of place in the mountains, yet moved with the confidence of someone who owned them. He wore a long gray coat made of fine wool, a silk vest, and a hat that likely cost more than Willa made in 2 years. His face was smooth, clean-shaven, with eyes the color of polished flint. Flanking him were 2 men who wore their gun belts low and tied down at the thigh-hired guns, their eyes scanning the tree line rather than the woman. Bringing up the rear was Deputy Miller, a man with a weak chin and a tin star pinned to a jacket that was 2 sizes too big for him. They rode right up to the porch. Willa did not step down. She stood her ground, the axe leaning against the wall within easy reach. "Good morning, Miss Hart," Silas Crowder said. His voice was smooth, cultivated in the East, lacking the rough edges of the frontier. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like a mockery than respect. "Mr. Crowder," Willa replied. She wiped her hands on her trousers. "To what do I owe the visit? I do not think you came for firewood." Silas chuckled, a dry sound. He swung down from his saddle, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Sharp. I like that. No, I did not come for wood. I came to talk about business." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rolled document tied with a red ribbon. He walked to the edge of the porch, placing 1 polished boot on the bottom step. "I represent Northern Timber and Rail, as you surely know," Silas began, unrolling the paper. "We are moving forward with the development of this valley. It is a grand project. Miss Hart, a sawmill, a spur line connecting to the Northern Pacific, and a dam to control the flow for floating logs." Willa felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "I heard rumors." "Progress is more than a rumor," Silas said. He held the paper out toward her. "This is a purchase agreement, standard deed transfer. The company is prepared to offer you $500 for your claim. That includes the cabin, the river frontage, and the timber rights. $500. It was a fortune. It was more money than Willa had ever seen at one time. It was enough to move to a city, buy a dress shop or a boarding house. It was enough to never chop another piece of wood again. "And if I do not want to sell?" Willa asked, her voice steady. Silas smiled, but the flint in his eyes did not soften. "Now, why would a sensible young woman refuse look at this life? Miss Hart, it is hard, lonely, dangerous. You are barely 20 years old. Do you want to spend the next 40 years breaking your back dragging logs through the mud? We are offering you a chance to change your life. A fresh start, somewhere civilized." Deputy Miller cleared his throat nervously from his horse. "You really ought to consider it. Willa, it is a generous offer." "It is my home," Willa said. "My father is buried on the ridge. My mother walked this river before there was a town. Sentiment is a luxury," Silas said, his tone sharpening slightly. "The reality is that this dam is going to be built. We have the federal permits pending. Once the governor signs the charter, this valley becomes an eminent domain zone for industrial development. The water level will rise. Miss Hart, this cabin will be 10 feet underwater." "So you are telling me I have no choice?" Willa said. "I am telling you that you have a choice between $500 and a wet swim," Silas said. He stepped up onto the porch, invading her space. "Sign the paper. Be smart. Do not be the stubborn native girl who stood in front of a train." Willa stared at the pen he held out. The pressure was immense. She could feel the eyes of the gunmen on her. She felt small, singular, a lone pine tree facing a wall of fire. The town wanted this. The law wanted this. Who was she to say no, she is not going to sign anything? "Silas," the voice came from the side of the cabin. low and dangerous. Every head turned. Silas stiffened, his smooth composure cracking for a fraction of a second. Boone Carver stepped around the corner of the cabin. He held his Hawken rifle loosely. The barrel pointed at the ground, but his thumb was resting on the hammer. He looked wilder than the men on horses, his buckskin stained with the rain of the night before, his beard rough and untamed. Silas stared at him, and then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, Silas drawled. I wondered where you had crawled off to. Boone Carver, the man who thinks he owns the mountains. I do not own them, Boone said, walking steadily until he stood between Willa and the men on horses, placing himself as a physical barrier. But I know when a man is trying to steal them. You know this man, Willa asked, looking from Boone to Silas. We are old acquaintances, Silas said, laughing softly. Boone here used to be the best guide in the territory. Worked for me 3 years ago when we first surveyed the upper basin. He took my money, ate my food, and then decided he had a conscience. Boone's eyes were cold. I decided I would not help you poison the water. He set fire to a supply depot, Silas said to Willa, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Cost the company $2,000 and delayed us a season. There is still a warrant out for arson in Wyoming. Isn't there, Boone? Or did you run far enough to outpace the law? It was an accident, Boone said, his jaw tightening. Was it? Silas raised an eyebrow. Just like the rock slide that broke the leg of my chief engineer. You are a curse. Carver, everywhere you go, trouble follows. You think you are protecting this girl? You are just going to bring your bad luck down on her head. Boone did not flinch, but Willa saw his knuckles whiten around the stock of his rifle. He did not deny it. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Leave him out of this, Willa said, her voice cutting through the tension. She stepped forward, moving past Boone so that she stood directly in front of Silas. Silas looked down at her, amused. He is a criminal, my dear, a drifter who got a few men hurt because he could not accept that the world changes. Is that the kind of counsel you want to keep? Willa looked at the contract in Silas's hand. She looked at the signature line waiting for her name. Then she looked past him, at the river. The water was brown and angry, but it was hers. The trees on the ridge were hers. The grave of the man who had taught her to read and the woman who had taught her to listen to the wind, they were part of this soil. If she sold it, she sold them. If she took the money, she admitted that her life here had no value other than a price tag. My father built this cabin, Willa said. Her voice shook, but she forced the tremor down. He cut the logs. He laid the stone. He told me that as long as I stood on this ground, I answered no man but God. She looked Silas in the eye. $500 is a lot of money, she said. But it is not enough to buy my father's sweat, and it is not enough to buy my mother's memory. She pushed the contract away. Get off my porch. The silence that followed was absolute. Deputy Miller looked anxious, his hand hovering near his holster. The hired guns shifted in their saddles. Silas stared at her for a long moment, the smile vanishing from his face. He looked at the contract, then slowly rolled it back up. You are making a mistake, he said softly. A very expensive mistake. He turned his gaze to Boone. And you? If I see you interfering with company property again, I will not bother with the sheriff. I will handle it myself. Right on, Silas, Boone said. Silas mounted his horse. He looked down at Willa one last time. Winter is coming. Miss Hart. It is going to be a hard one. When the snow is 10 feet deep and the wolves are scratching at the door, remember that you could have been sitting by a coal fire in a brick house. He spurred his horse and wheeled around. The group thundered off, disappearing back into the mist, leaving the contract's rejection hanging in the cold air. Willa stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. Then, her knees gave way. She sat down heavily on the bench, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Boone did not move for a long time. He watched the trail, ensuring they were truly gone. Then he leaned his rifle against the wall and turned to her. You should have taken the money, he said gruffly. Willa looked up at him, anger flaring through her fear. Is that what you think? I think Silas is a man who does not lose, Boone said. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked up at the mountains, his expression grim. He is not just going to build a dam, Willa. He is going to strip-cut the upper slopes. I saw the survey markers yesterday. What does that mean? It means when they cut the trees on the high ridge, there is nothing to hold the snowpack, Boone explained. When the spring melt comes, or a heavy rain like last night, the water won't soak in. It will run straight off the rock. It will bring the mud and the stones with it. He pointed to the river, churning just 20 yards from her door. The river will not just rise, he said. It will rage. It will cut a new channel right through this valley. Your cabin is right in the path. Willa stared at the water. She had seen floods before, but Boone was describing a catastrophe. Why are you telling me this? She asked. To scare me into selling. To tell you the truth, Boone said. Silas does not need to buy you out. He can just wait for the mountain to wash you away. He knows it. That is why he threatened you with the winter. Willa felt a cold dread settle over her. She had won the argument, but she was losing the war. She was one woman with an axe against a company with millions of dollars and the power to reshape the earth itself. I cannot leave, she whispered. I do not know how to be anything else but this. Boone looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the stubborn pride that had made her stand up to a man like Silas Crowder. He remembered the night before, how she had fought the wind to save her wood. She was strong, stronger than she knew, but strength was not enough against an avalanche. He took a deep breath, the scent of wet pine filling his lungs. He had spent years running from his past, hiding in the high country, trying to wash the guilt of his mistakes off his hands. He had told himself he was done with people, done with causes, but looking at Willa Hart, standing alone in her oversized coat, defending a patch of mud as if it were a kingdom, he felt something stir in his chest. It was an old feeling, one he thought he had buried under the ashes of that supply depot 3 years ago. If you stay, Boone said slowly, you are going to have a fight on your hands. Silas will cut the fences. He will scare off your customers. He will try to starve you out before the water does. I have a rifle, Willa said defensively. 1 rifle against 6 hired guns is not a fight. Boone said, it is a funeral. Willa glared at him. Then what do you suggest? Mountain Man, should I run? No, Boone said. He stepped closer, his blue eyes locking onto hers. I am saying that if you want to keep this land, you cannot fight this war by yourself. Willa fell silent. She looked at his scarred face, the rough beard, the dangerous stillness of him. He was offering something. Not charity, no pity, an alliance. Why would you help me? She asked. You said to yourself, you bring bad luck. Maybe, Boone said. A shadow crossed his face. Or maybe I just hate seeing a bully win. He picked up his rifle. I will be up on the ridge. If you see smoke, you know I am watching. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked away toward the trees, his boots making no sound on the wet earth. Willa watched him go. She touched the wood of the porch railing, feeling the rough grain under her fingers. She was terrified. Silas Crowder would come back, and he would bring more than paper next time. The river was rising. The mountain was unstable. But for the first time in 3 years, as she watched the broad back of the mountain man disappear into the forest, Willa Hart did not feel entirely alone. She stood up, grabbed her axe, and walked down to the riverbank. There was wood to chop, and now there was a war to prepare for. The trail leading up to the high ridges where the Salish people had made their winter camp was not a road meant for wagons or horses. It was a deer track, narrow and unforgiving, winding through the thick timber of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Willa Hart climbed it with the steady, rhythmic pace of a woman who had walked these mountains since she could stand. The air up here was thinner, sharper. It bit at the inside of her lungs. She had left her axe at the cabin, but she carried the weight of Silas Crowder's threat on her shoulders. The river below looked like a silver ribbon from this height, deceptive in its beauty, hiding the violence of the current that Boone Carver had warned her about. Willa was seeking answers. She was seeking kin. when she reached the clearing where the hide tippies stood against the backdrop of the gray granite peaks. The camp was silent. Smoke curled lazily from the vent holes, but there were no children playing, no dogs barking. It was the silence of a people holding their breath. A figure stepped out from the shadow of the largest lodge. It was Talon Bear River. He was young, perhaps 2 years older than Willa, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same red rock as the canyon walls. His black hair was braided with strips of otter fur, and he wore a heavy buffalo coat. Talon was her cousin by blood, the son of her mother's sister, but in spirit. He often felt like a stranger from a distant land. "Willa," he said. He did not smile. He did not offer a hand. He simply acknowledged her presence with a nod that was more guard duty than greeting. "Talon," Willa replied, stopping 10 feet from him. "I came to speak with the council." "The council is in prayer," Talon said. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in her canvas trousers and the heavy wool coat that had belonged to her white father. "They are asking the spirits for guidance on the path." "The path?" Willa asked. "What path?" "The path away from here," Talon said bluntly. He gestured toward the north, toward the deep, rugged wilderness that lay beyond the valley. "The elders have heard of the man Crowder. They have heard of the iron road he wants to bring, and the saws that scream like dying animals. They have decided we will strike camp before the first heavy snow. We move north." Willa felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her boots. "Move, but this is the winter ground. The valley protects us from the worst of the wind. If you go north now, the cold will take the old ones." "Better the cold takes them than the white soldiers," Talon said, his voice hard. "Crowder has papers from the Great Father in Washington. If we stay, and if we fight for the river, the soldiers will come. We are few. Willa, we cannot fight the whole world. So you just leave." Willa's voice rose, cracking with frustration. "You leave the graves. You leave the river." Talon stepped closer, his expression softening just a fraction, revealing the pain beneath the warrior's mask. "We leave to survive. Cousin, land is land, but the people are the blood. If the blood spills, the land forgets us anyway." He looked at her, and for the first time, Willa saw the pity in his eyes. It was a look that stung worse than the scorn of the miners in town. "You stay, Willa," Talon said quietly. "You stay in your wooden box by the water. You fight for your father's claim, but do not ask the tribe to die for a white man's piece of paper." Willa stood alone in the clearing as Talon turned back to the lodge. The rejection was absolute. She turned and began the long descent back to the valley, her heart heavy as a stone. The walk down was a journey through her own fractured identity. In the town, she was the river rat, the half-breed, the girl who smelled of pine pitch and poverty. They laughed at her virginity as if it were a joke, and they sneered at her bloodline. To them, she was too native to be civilized. But up here, among her mother's people, she was the daughter of a white trapper. She was the girl who lived in a square house and sold the bones of the forest for silver coins. To them, she was too white to understand the survival of the tribe. She stopped at a switchback, looking down at her cabin. It was a tiny speck of brown against the vast white and gray of the coming winter. "Where do I belong?" she whispered to the wind. The wind did not answer. It only blew colder. That night, Willa did not go back to her empty cabin. The silence there was too loud. Instead, she found herself walking toward the timberline, toward the faint smell of wood smoke that was not her own. Boone Carver's camp was a simple lean-to tucked under a rock overhang, sheltered from the wind but commanding a view of the entire valley approach. A small fire crackled in a pit lined with stones. Boone sat on a log, cleaning his rifle with a rag dipped in oil. He did not look up when she approached. "Coffee is hot," he said. Willa sat on a flat rock across the fire from him. She accepted the tin cup he offered. The metal warmed her frozen fingers. "The tribe is leaving," she said, staring into the flames. Boone nodded slowly. "I figured they would. Talon is a hothead, but the elders are cautious. They remember the last war. They think I am a fool for staying, Willa said. Boone set the rifle down and looked at her. The firelight danced in his blue eyes, softening the harsh lines of his face. Are you? Maybe, Willa admitted. But that is all I have. If I leave, I am just a drifter. Like, she stopped herself, biting her lip. Like me, Boone finished for her. There was no anger in his voice, only a dry resignation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pouch of tobacco, rolling a cigarette with one hand. You heard what Silas said about the accident. I heard, Willa said. I did not believe his version. Boone lit the cigarette with a twig from the fire. He inhaled deeply, letting the smoke drift out into the night air. It was 3 years ago, Boone began, his voice low and gravelly. I was guiding Silas in the Bitterroot Range. He wanted to find a route for a logging road. I needed the money. I told myself it was just a job. He paused, looking at his hands. Then I saw what they did. They did not just cut trees. They stripped the land, left it naked. The streams turned to mud. The fish died. I tried to tell Silas to leave the buffer zones, to respect the grade. He laughed, said trees were just money standing up. Willa watched him. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the weight of a memory that had never set him down. So I tried to slow them down, Boone said. I led the survey team up a box canyon, told them it was a shortcut. I thought they would just get stuck, lose a week, maybe give up on that section. But I did not account for the loose shale on the south face. He took a long drag of the cigarette. One of the wagons threw a wheel. The vibration, or maybe just bad luck. It triggered a slide. 2 men, good men, just working for a wage. They were buried before I could even shout. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the ghosts of the dead. Willa did not look away. She did not pull back. Silas called it murder, Boone whispered. The law called it criminal negligence. I called it the price of arrogance. I thought I could control the mountain. Willa, I thought I could play God and teach them a lesson. Instead, I just dug 2 graves. Willa reached across the space between them. She did not take his hand, that would be too much. Too soon, but she placed her fingers on the rough wool of his sleeve. You tried to save the land, Willa said softly. You made a mistake, but Silas, he destroys on purpose. That is a different kind of sin. Boone looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. He looked surprised, as if he had expected judgment and found grace instead. I have been running from that slide for 3 years, he said. Living up here where no one can get hurt if I make a wrong step. You are not running anymore, Willa said. You stood on my porch. You stood between me and Silas. Maybe I am just tired of running, Boone said. Or maybe I finally found something worth standing for. The moment hung in the air, fragile and charged. They were 2 broken things. A girl split between 2 worlds and a man haunted by his own shadow, finding a strange kind of wholeness in the firelight. 2 days later, the war began in earnest. Willa was chopping kindling when Boone came down from the ridge, moving with a speed that alarmed her. Grab your coat, he said, and bring a knife. What is it? Willa asked, already reaching for her gear. Markers, Boone said. Silas's crew was out at dawn. They have painted the cut line. Willa followed him. They moved swiftly through the forest, a mile upstream from her cabin. When they reached the grove of ancient cedars that protected the northern flank of the valley, Willa gasped. Bright red paint slashed across the bark of the trees. Ugly, violent X marks. They formed a line that cut straight through the heart of the forest, marking a path for a road that would destabilize the entire slope. If they cut this line, Boone said, pointing to the slope, the first heavy rain will bring all this mud down into the river. It will choke the channel. We cannot stop them from cutting, Willa said, feeling a surge of helplessness. They have the axes and the men. We cannot stop them, a deep voice said from behind them. But we can make them cut the wrong trees. Willa turned. Talon stood there. He had not gone north yet. He carried a scraper made of elk bone and a pot of red ochre mixed with fat, a traditional paint used for war, but similar enough in color to the company's dye. Talon? Willa breathed. I thought you left. Sure, the council prays. Talon grunted, stepping forward. I act, if the river dies, the spirits will have nowhere to drink. And he looked at Willa, his expression stoic. You are blood, even if you are stubborn. Boone looked at the young warrior, and a silent understanding passed between them. The mountain man and the brave, united by a common enemy. We have to move fast, Boone said. The cutting crew comes tomorrow. For the next 6 hours, they worked. It was grueling, meticulous labor. They used knives and the bone scraper to flake away the red paint from the cedars, rubbing dirt and moss into the bark to hide the scars. Then, they moved 300 yards to the west, to a rocky, treacherous ravine where the timber was knotted and the ground was unstable for horses. There, Talon and Boone painted new X marks on the trees. They forged the path of destruction, diverting it away from the heart of the valley and into a trap of stone and bramble. Willa worked beside them, her hands stained with red paint that looked disturbingly like blood. She felt a fierce, savage joy. She was not just a victim waiting for the water to rise. She was fighting back. By the time they finished, the sun was setting. They retreated to a high rocky outcropping that overlooked the river to watch the work of their hands. The three of them stood there, Willa in the center, Boone on her right, Talon on her left. Below them, the river churned, indifferent to their efforts, yet alive because of them. In the town of Bozeman, the talk was already spreading in the saloons and the general store. They spoke of the river girl who had gone mad. They whispered about the killer guide who had come down from the peaks. They muttered about the savage who refused to stay on the reservation. They call us fools, Willa said, looking down at the lights of the town flickering in the distance. Let them talk, Talon said, wiping the red paint from his hands. Wolves do not concern themselves with the opinions of sheep. Boone stood close to Willa. He smelled of pine pitch and sweat, a scent that had become strangely comforting to her. They will figure it out, Boone warned. When the cutting crew hits that ravine tomorrow and breaks their saws on the ironwood and twists their ankles in the rocks, Silas will know. Let him know, Willa said. She looked up at Boone. Her eyes were fierce, reflecting the last light of the dying sun. Let him know that the valley has teeth. Boone looked down at her. For weeks, he had seen a girl who needed protecting, a victim of circumstance. But now, seeing her with paint on her hands and fire in her eyes, he saw something else. He saw the strength of the mountains themselves. He saw a woman who could stand in the storm and not break. He realized, with a sudden jolt in his chest, that the valley was just dirt and rock. The trees were just wood. The river was just water. But Willa was the heart of it all. If she broke, the valley broke. If she stood, the valley stood. You are a dangerous woman, Willa Hart, Boone murmured. Willa looked at him, and for a moment, the war and the river faded. There was just the man with the scar and the glacier eyes. She felt a pull, stronger than the current below, a terrifying and wonderful sense that she was no longer dragging her cart alone. I have dangerous friends, she replied softly. Talon looked at them, shook his head, and made a sound that might have been a laugh. The white man talks too much. Come. The fire is low, and the night is cold. They turned from the cliff. 3 outcasts bound by a secret war. The rising action had begun. The skirmish of the trees was won, but the battle for the river was only just starting. And in the darkness of the woods, the bond between the girl, the mountain man, and the warrior was hardening into something that even Silas Crowder's money could not easily break. Silas Crowder did not waste time with anger. He responded with efficiency. 2 days after the false markers were discovered, the whine of the cross-cut saws began to echo from the high ridge like the buzzing of giant, metallic hornets. They were cutting the old growth. From the valley floor, Willa could see the gaps appearing in the tree line, jagged teeth missing from the mountain's smile. The company men worked with a ruthless speed, stripping the protective canopy that held the soil to the rock. Talon came to Willa's cabin that afternoon, his face painted with black ash. They are cutting the sacred grove, he said, his voice trembling with a rage that bordered on madness. "The elders sent a messenger." The foreman laughed and showed them a rifle. "He said if one brave steps onto the cut line, he will call the cavalry from Fort Ellis. You cannot go up there." "Talon," Willa said, grabbing his arm. "That is what they want. An excuse to shoot. Let them shoot," Talon snarled. "Better to die fighting than to watch the spirits bleed." It took both Willa and Boone to talk him down, to convince him that a massacre would not save the trees. But the mountain itself had no such restraint. The rain began at dusk. It was not a storm, but a steady, relentless deluge that poured onto the newly exposed earth high above. Without the roots to drink it and the needles to break its fall, the water gathered, it pooled in the skid trails, mixed with loose dirt and slash, and grew heavy. At midnight, gravity collected its due. Willa was awakened by a sound that was not thunder. It was a roar, deep and terrestrial, like the earth clearing its throat. She sat up in bed, heart hammering. "Boone!" she screamed, though she knew he was up at his camp. The door burst open. Boone was there, drenched and wild-eyed. "Get out!" he roared. "Now!" He did not wait for her to dress. He grabbed her arm, hauling her out of the bed and through the door into the pouring rain. They had made it 10 yards when the mud hit. It was not a wall of water, but a slurry of earth, rocks, and shattered timber. It slammed into the side of the cabin with the force of a battering ram. Willa watched in horror as the corner of her home, the home her father had built, buckled. Logs snapped like matchsticks. The slurry surged toward the river, catching her wood stacks. Months of labor, hundreds of dollars in potential sales, were swept away in a chaotic churn of brown sludge. "My wood!" Willa cried, instinctively turning back. "Leave it!" Boone shouted. He wrapped an arm around her waist, dragging her toward the higher ground of the cliff face. But the mud was fast. A slurry wave caught Willa's legs, knocking her down. The cold muck sucked at her, heavy and suffocating. A massive pine root, torn from the earth, tumbled toward them, tumbling end over end in the flow. Boone threw himself over her. He shoved her body into a shallow crevice in the rock wall, pressing his own body against hers to shield her. The root slammed into the rock inches from Boone's head, showering them with dirt and bark. The roar was deafening. For a minute, the world was nothing but noise and the terrifying pressure of the earth moving. Willa was pressed flat against the cold stone, Boone's heavy weight pinning her there. She could feel his heart thumping wildly against her chest. His breath was hot on her neck. His arms were locked around her, creating a cage of muscle and bone that kept the death outside. Slowly, the roar subsided to a gurgle. The slide had passed, dumping its load into the churning river. Boone did not move immediately. He held her there, his face buried in her wet hair, his breathing ragged. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice close to her ear. "No," Willa whispered. She was trembling violently, from cold and shock. Boone pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her. They were soaked, covered in mud, huddled in a crack in the rock while the rain washed over them. His face was inches from hers. She could see the droplets of water caught in his eyelashes. In that moment, the terror of the slide faded, replaced by a sudden, intense awareness of him, the way his hand cupped the back of her head, protective and gentle, the heat radiating from his chest. He looked at her mouth, and for a second, Willa thought he would kiss her. Her breath hitched. She wanted him to. She wanted to feel something other than fear, but Boone closed his eyes for a second, a muscle feathering in his jaw, and then he exhaled slowly. He pulled back, putting a respectful distance between their bodies. "We have to get to high ground," he said, his voice rough. "There might be more coming." He helped her stand, his grip firm but careful, as if she were made of glass. The morning revealed the devastation. The slide had taken half of Willa's cabin. The roof had collapsed on one side, and the interior was filled with mud. Her wood stacks were gone, washed downriver to be picked apart by scavengers. Willa stood in the wreckage, numb. By noon, Silas Crowder was in town, standing on a crate in front of the general store. "I warned her," Silas shouted to the gathered crowd. "I told Miss Hart that her location was unstable. This slide proves it. That cabin is a hazard. It blocks the natural flow. If that debris had dammed the river, the whole town could have flooded." "He is right," a miner shouted. "Get her out of there before she kills us all." "Clear the bank," another voice cried. The mood in the town turned ugly. Fear made people cruel. They did not see a girl who had lost her home. They saw a threat to their own safety. That night, Willa stayed in the ruins of her cabin, trying to salvage what she could. A few blankets, her father's Bible, her mother's beaded necklace. Boone was up on the ridge, keeping watch, but the darkness was thick. Around 2 a.m, Willa woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke from a stove, but the acrid, chemical smell of kerosene. She scrambled out of her makeshift bed in the corner of the dry room. Orange light flickered through the cracks in the logs. "Fire!" she screamed, choking on the fumes. She grabbed her coat and ran out the back door just as the front wall erupted in flames. 3 riders were galloping away into the night, their torches thrown. "No!" Willa shrieked. She ran toward the river, grabbing a bucket, but it was futile. The old, dry logs, soaked in oil, burned with a terrifying speed. Boone came tearing down the slope on his horse a minute later, sliding to a halt. He jumped off, running to her. "Willa!" He grabbed her as she tried to run back toward the burning structure. "Let me go," she sobbed, fighting him. "My things, my father's papers. It is gone. Willa!" Boone shouted, holding her tight against his chest. "It is gone. Do not die for wood." Willa collapsed in his arms, watching her history turn to ash. The fire roared, consuming the last physical evidence that the Hart family had ever existed in this valley. She had no home. She had no wood to sell. She had nothing. The sun rose on a blackened scar where the cabin had stood. Smoke still drifted from the embers. Willa sat on a large stone by the river's edge. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Her hands were raw. She held a single, half-burnt piece of firewood in her lap, clutching it like a doll. She looked at the river. It flowed on, indifferent. "I have nothing," she whispered to the water. "They took it all." Boone walked down from the tree line. He had spent the last hours ensuring the fire did not spread to the forest. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, but he moved with a quiet determination. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the devastation, then at the girl who looked smaller and more broken than he had ever seen her. He knelt down in the mud so that he was eye level with her. "Willa," he said softly. She did not look at him. She stared at the burnt wood in her lap. "I am just a beggar now. Boone, I have no wood to sell. I have no roof. I have no name in this valley anymore." Boone reached out and gently took the charred piece of wood from her hands. He tossed it aside. "You are not just the girl who sells wood. Willa," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. Willa looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a hollow despair. "Then what am I? What is left to sell?" Boone reached out, his rough, calloused hand cupping her chin. He tilted her face up toward him. The morning sun caught the tears on her cheeks. "The wood is already sold, sweetheart," Boone whispered. He leaned in. He did not rush. He gave her every chance to pull away. But Willa did not move. She watched his eyes, seeing the pain and the hope and the fierce protectiveness burning there. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. Not at first. It was a kiss of rescue. His lips were warm and firm against hers. He tasted smoke and coffee. It was a grounding thing, an anchor in the storm. Willa let out a small, broken sound and leaned into him. Her hands came up to clutch the front of his buckskin coat. The kiss deepened, becoming desperate, an affirmation of life amidst the ashes. Boone pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. He looked deep into her eyes. "Sell me your heart instead," he said. Willa stared at him, her breath hitching. "My heart." "Give it to me," Boone said. "Let me keep it safe. Silas can burn the house. He can wash away the logs, but he cannot touch what is between us." Willa felt a crack in the wall of her despair. She looked at this man, this scarred, lonely mountain man who had run from the world until he found her. She realized that she had been selling pieces of herself, her labor, her time, her pride to survive, but she had never given anything away for free. "It is a damaged heart, Boone," she whispered. "It is full of smoke and anger." "So is mine," Boone said. "It fits." He kissed her again, and this time, Willa kissed him back. She poured all her grief and her fear into it, and he took it all, holding her steady as the river rushed by. For the next week, they lived in a temporary shelter Boone built near his camp, high up in the rocks where the air was clear. It was a small, intimate space, a lean-to made of spruce boughs and canvas. At night, they lay under the buffalo robes, the fire flickering at the entrance. The intimacy grew slowly. It was in the way Boone brushed her hair out of her eyes, the way Willa mended the tear in his shirt while he skinned a rabbit. The tension was there, a low hum of desire. But Boone never pushed. One night, as the wind howled outside, they lay side by side. Boone's arm was under her head. Willa turned to face him. "You could have left," she said. "After the fire, you could have gone back to the mountains." "I am in the mountains," Boone said, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb. "You know what I mean," Willa said. "Silas will kill you if you stay." "He will try," Boone corrected. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to her lips, then lower, to the pulse beating at the base of her throat. "Willa," he said, his voice rough, "if I touch you, if we do this, there is no going back. I am not a man who walks away twice." Willa reached up and touched the scar on his cheek. "I do not want you to walk away." She pulled him down to her. The firelight cast long shadows on the canvas walls. The wind sang its lonely song outside, but inside, there was only the sound of breathing and the rustle of furs. It was a claim, not of land or property, but of each other. A silent contract signed in the dark, binding them together against the world below. But the world below did not sleep. 3 days later, Talon appeared at their camp. He looked exhausted, his horse lathered. "Silas has returned from the capital," Talon said, not dismounting. He looked from Boone to Willa, seeing the change in them, the way they stood closer together, a unit now. "Does he have the papers?" Boone asked, stepping forward. "He has the papers," Talon confirmed. "The governor signed the eminent domain order. The sheriff has the eviction notice. They are coming for the river. Willa, they are going to start blasting the rock for the dam foundation in 2 days." Willa felt a cold dread wash over her newfound happiness. 2 days, she asked. "If they blast the narrows," Talon said, "the fish run dead. The valley floods. The tribe has to leave." He looked at Boone. "The elders are packing, but I am not leaving. I have 12 men. We are going to stop the blasting." "That is suicide," Boone said. "Silas has 20 hired guns now, plus the law. Then we die," Talon said simply. "But we do not run." He turned his horse. "If you are going to fight, cousin, now is the time. If not, enjoy your mountain man. But know that the river will curse you if you let it die." He rode off, disappearing into the trees. Willa stood frozen. She looked at Boone. "He is right," she said. "If they build the dam, everything is gone. Not just the cabin, the whole valley." "If we go down there," Boone said, grabbing her shoulders, "we are walking into a war. Silas has the law on his side." "I do not care about the law," Willa said. "I care about the land." She looked at him, her eyes searching for him. "I gave you my heart, Boone, but my heart is tied to that river. If I let them kill it, I am empty. I have nothing to give you." Boone looked at her. He saw the terrifying resolve in her face. He knew then that the quiet life he had hoped for, the life of hiding up here in the safety of the peaks, was a fantasy. He could not keep her heart if he let her soul be destroyed. He sighed, a long, heavy sound of a man accepting his fate. He turned and walked to the corner of the shelter, picking up his Hawken rifle and his powder horn. "Pack the horses," Boone said. "If we are going to die, We might as well do it by the water. Willa watched him, a surge of love and terror overwhelming her. They were going back down, back to the ashes, back to the river, and this time, there would be no wood to sell, only blood to pay. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It brought the glint of steel. Willa Hart stood on the charred remains of her front porch, her boots sinking into the mixture of ash and mud that had once been her home. Beside her stood Boone Carver, his Hawken rifle resting easily in the crook of his arm, though his blue eyes scanned the tree line with the intensity of a hawk. To her left was Talon Bear River, flanked by 12 Salish warriors, their faces painted with the red ochre of war. Behind them, a handful of miners and homesteaders who had grown tired of the company's bullying stood nervously, clutching pickaxes and old shotguns. They were a ragged army, bound by nothing but stubbornness and the river that flowed behind them. Across the clearing, the enemy arrived with the precision of a military parade. Silas Crowder rode a black stallion, his gray coat immaculate, a stark contrast to the devastation around him. Flanking him was not the bumbling Deputy Miller, but a new man, Sheriff Dalton from the capital, a man with a reputation for hanging first and asking questions later. Behind them rode 20 men, hired guns with low-slung holsters and eyes that had seen too much violence to flinch at the sight of a few angry locals. They stopped 20 yards away. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rushing of the Gallatin River. Silas dismounted. He walked to the center of the clearing, holding a sheaf of papers high in the air like a weapon. "This is a federal eviction order," Silas announced, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the water. "Signed by the territorial governor and ratified by the circuit court. This land is now the property of Northern Timber and Rail for the purpose of essential infrastructure development." He looked at Willa, a smirk touching his lips. "It is over. Miss Hart, pack what little ash you have left and leave, or be removed." Willa stepped forward. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice was steady. She had lost her house, her wood, and her solitude. She had nothing left to fear. "You speak of essential development," Willa said, pointing to the river. "That water is the blood of this valley. It feeds the farms. It washes the gold for the miners. It gives drinks to the deer and the bear. You want to choke it with concrete so you can float dead trees to a mill that will line your pockets. That is not development. Mr. Crowder, that is murder. Progress requires sacrifice." Silas retorted smoothly. "The railroad needs ties. The cities need lumber. This valley is just one small cog in the machine of civilization. Do not be a Luddite, girl. Think of the jobs. Think of the future. We think of the past." Talon stepped forward, his voice deep and resonant. "My grandfathers are buried on that ridge. Their bones are in the soil you want to wash away. You signed treaties, white man. You promised that as long as the grass grows and the water runs, this land would be ours to hunt. Now you bring papers to say the water belongs to you. The treaties were with savages who did not know how to use the land." Silas sneered. "We are bringing industry. We are bringing order." Sheriff Dalton spat on the ground. "Enough talk. Silas, the law is clear. You people have 5 minutes to disperse. Any man or woman still standing here will be arrested for trespassing and inciting a riot." "We are not moving," Boone said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the hired guns shift in their saddles. "This is not company land. It is stolen land." Silas sighed, a theatrical gesture of patience wearing thin. He nodded to one of his men, a scar-faced gunman named Pike. "Start the survey. Put the first stake right there." He pointed to the spot where Willa's hearthstone still lay cracked in the mud. Pike dismounted, grinning. He grabbed a heavy wooden stake and a sledgehammer. He walked toward the ruins, walking with an arrogant swagger. "Stop!" Talon warned, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Pike ignored him. He planted the stake in the ash. "Make me redskin." He raised the hammer. "I said stop!" Talon shouted, stepping forward. Pike dropped the hammer and drew his pistol in a blur of motion. He did not aim to kill, but to intimidate. He fired a shot into the mud. inches from Talon's moccasin. The crack of the gunshot shattered the standoff. "Fire!" a warrior screamed. Chaos erupted. It happened so fast that Willa barely had time to blink. The air filled with a deafening roar of black powder. Smoke bloomed like white flowers across the clearing. "Get down!" Boone roared. He tackled Willa, dragging her behind a large stack of half-burnt logs that had survived the fire. Bullets whizzed overhead, thumping into the wood like angry hornets. Willa pressed her hands over her ears, the scream trapped in her throat. She looked up to see Boone rising to one knee, firing his Hawken. The heavy rifle boomed, and one of Silas's gunmen spun out of his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Boone reloaded with practiced calm, pouring powder, ramming the ball, capping the nipple, all while lead chipped the bark inches from his face. "Stay down," Boone ordered her, his eyes wild. Willa looked across the clearing. Talon was fighting like a demon, moving between the horses, using his knife and a captured pistol. The miners were firing from behind the trees, their shotguns booming. But Silas's men were professionals. They were flanking, pushing forward, their repeating rifles laying down a withering suppression fire. They were losing. Willa could see it. The warriors were falling back. The miners were pinned down. She looked at the river. The water was high, swollen from the rains and the slide. And just upstream, hidden behind a bend in the bank, was the trap they had built. It was a desperation plan. A massive pile of drift logs and debris, held back by a single heavy rope lashed to a boulder. Boone and Talon had set it up 2 nights ago, a dam waiting to break. Willa looked at Boone. He was busy holding off 3 men on the right flank. He could not reach the rope. Talon was cut off on the left. The knife at her belt felt heavy. She was not a warrior. She was a woodcutter. She knew how to sever things. "Cover me!" Willa screamed at Boone. Before he could stop her, she scrambled out from behind the log pile. "Willa, no!" Boone shouted, but he swung his rifle, firing blindly to draw the enemy's fire. Willa ran. She stayed low, splashing through the shallows of the riverbank, mud flying up into her face. Her breath tore at her lungs. A bullet splashed into the water near her foot, sending a spray of icy drops against her cheek. She reached the bend. The rope was there, taut as a bowstring, humming with the tension of tons of timber pressing against it. She pulled her knife. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She looked back at the clearing. Silas was shouting orders, pointing toward her. He had seen her. "Stop her!" Silas screamed. "She is going to blow the stack!" 3 gunmen turned their horses toward the river. Willa gripped the knife with both hands. She thought of her father, dying in the bed that was now ash. She thought of the trees screaming as they fell. She thought of Boone, standing in the rain, telling her to sell him her heart. "For the river," she whispered. She brought the knife down. The hemp rope parted with a sound like a cannon shot. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the pile groaned. The massive logs, freed from their restraint, lurched forward. The current caught them. With a roar that drowned out the gunfire, the wooden avalanche began. Hundreds of tons of timber, roots, and debris surged down the channel. The water level rose instantly, creating a wall of brown fury that swept around the bend. "Look out!" a gunman shrieked. The flood hit the bank where Silas and his men were clustered. It was not just water. It was a battering ram of nature. Horses panicked, rearing and throwing their riders. Men scrambled for higher ground, their guns forgotten in the face of the deluge. The water surged over the bank, sweeping away the survey stakes, the equipment, and washing the ash of Willa's home into the current. 2 of the hired guns were knocked off their feet and carried downstream, flailing in the icy muck. Willa stood on the rock, panting, watching the chaos. She had done it. She had turned the river into a weapon. But Silas Crowder had not been swept away. He had managed to keep his horse on the high rise of the bank. He was wet, his fine coat ruined, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He saw Willa standing exposed on the rock. He pulled a long-barreled revolver from his holster. He did not aim at the warriors. He did not aim at Boone. He aimed at the girl who had defied him, "You witch!" Silas screamed. He cocked the hammer. Willa froze. There was nowhere to run. The river was behind her. The gun in front. "Willa!" The shout came from the side. Boone broke cover. He did not fire. His rifle was empty. He ran. He sprinted across the open mud, putting himself directly in the line of fire. Silas pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the air. Willa watched in horror as Boone jerked mid-stride. It was as if he had been punched by an invisible giant. He spun around, clutching his side, and collapsed into the mud. "Boone!" Willa screamed. She scrambled off the rock, splashing through the receding water, ignoring the danger. She reached him just as he tried to push himself up. His face was pale, his teeth gritted in agony. Blood was already soaking through his buckskin shirt, dark and terrifyingly fast. "Stay down!" he gasped, his hand grabbing her wrist. "Stay!" Willa fell to her knees beside him, pressing her hands over the wound, trying to staunch the flow. "No, no, no, look at me! Boone, look at me!" Across the clearing, Silas leveled his gun again, preparing to finish it, but he never got the chance. Talon appeared out of the smoke like a vengeful spirit. He did not use a gun. He swung a heavy war club, striking Silas's wrist with a bone-shattering crack. The revolver flew into the mud. Silas howled, clutching his broken arm, falling from his saddle. He scrambled backward, trying to reach for a second pistol in his boot, but Talon was on him. The young warrior pinned Silas to the ground, his knife pressed against the businessman's throat. The fighting stopped. The hired guns, seeing their boss captured and the river raging, threw down their weapons or fled into the trees. Sheriff Dalton stood with his hands raised, his face white as a sheet. "Do it!" Talon hissed, looking down at Silas. "Bleed him like he bled the land." Silas stared up at the knife, his eyes bulging. "You cannot kill me. I am a citizen. I have rights. If you kill me, the army will burn every Indian village from here to the Dakota line." Talon's hand trembled. The desire for vengeance was a palpable heat radiating off him. He wanted to slice the throat of the man who had desecrated the sacred grove. "Talon!" Willa shouted. Her voice was desperate. She was holding Boone's head in her lap, her hands slick with his blood. "Do not kill him." Talon looked at her, his eyes wild. "He shot him. Willa, he deserves to die. If you kill him, we lose," Willa cried, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "If he dies, he is a martyr. The company will say savages murdered a businessman. They will send soldiers. They will take everything. He has to pay," Talon roared. "He will pay!" Willa said, "We have the sheriff here. We have witnesses. He shot an unarmed man. He started a war on a federal claim. Let the judge hang him. Talon. Do not let his blood stain your soul." Talon looked at Silas, then at Willa, and finally at the river that was slowly calming down. He breathed heavily, the battle rage warring with his wisdom. He looked at Boone, who was pale and still on the ground. "For the future," Talon whispered. He pulled the knife away. He grabbed Silas by the collar and hauled him up, slamming him against a tree. "Tie him up," Talon ordered his warriors, "and grab the sheriff. We will go to the judge." Willa turned her attention back to Boone. His eyes were fluttering closed. The blood was slowing, but there was too much of it on the ground. "Boone," she sobbed, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Stay with me. You promised. You said you do not walk away twice." Boone opened his eyes. They were hazy, the blue ice melting into a gray fog. He looked at her, trying to focus. A faint, crooked smile touched his lips. Did the wood sell?" he whispered weakly. Willa let out a choked laugh through her tears. "Yes, it sold. It washed them all away." "Good," Boone wheezed. He coughed, a bubble of red appearing at the corner of his mouth. "That is good business." He gripped her hand, his fingers weak but desperate. "Willa," he breathed. "I am cold." "I am here," she said, leaning down, pressing her cheek against his. "I am right here. I am keeping you warm." "The heart," Boone murmured, his voice fading to a whisper that was almost lost in the sound of the river. "You gave me the heart." "Yes." Willa whispered fiercely into his ear. "I sold you my heart, mountain man. Don't you dare give it back now. You hear me? You keep it. You hold on to it." Boone's hand went slack in hers. His eyes slid shut. "Boone!" Willa screamed, shaking him. There was no answer. Only the rushing of the Gallatin River, carrying the wreckage of the battle downstream, indifferent to the woman weeping over the body of the man who had finally stopped running. The sun dipped below the canyon wall, casting a long shadow over the valley. The river rumbled on, a deep, mournful sound, as Silas Crowder sat bound against a tree, watching the ruin he had caused. Willa Hart held the lifeless weight of her love in her arms, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. The gunshot that had echoed through the valley did more than pierce Boone Carver's side. It shattered the illusion of civilization that Silas Crowder had carefully constructed. The town of Bozeman, often willing to turn a blind eye to the rough dealings of progress, could not ignore the sight of a wealthy industrialist shooting an unarmed man who was shielding a woman. The violence had been too public, too raw. When the smoke cleared, the miners who had stood with Silas lowered their weapons, shame coloring their soot-stained faces. They were hard men, used to brawling and claiming disputes, but they were not butchers. They watched as Willa Hart, her face streaked with mud and tears, pressed her hands against the bleeding wound of the mountain man, screaming for help. It was not the sheriff who moved first, but the town doctor, Dr. Samuel Albright, who had ridden out with the posse. He pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand, shouting for men to make a stretcher from the very wood Willa had sent crashing down the river. They carried Boone not to the town, where the noise and the dirt might fester the wound, but up the winding trail to the temporary camp of the Salish people. It was Talon's demand. He bled for the land, the warrior had said, his voice brooking no argument. The land will heal him. For 3 days and 3 nights, the valley held its breath. Inside the large buffalo hide lodge, the air was thick with the scent of burning sage, sweetgrass, and the sharp, medicinal tang of carbolic acid that Dr. Albright had left behind. A fire burned low in the center, casting dancing shadows on the walls that whispered of old spirits and ancient protections. Willa did not leave Boone's side. She sat on a pile of furs, watching the rise and fall of his chest. He was pale, the rugged tan of his skin fading to a sickly gray under the sheen of fever sweat. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of his side, missing the lung but breaking a rib and tearing through muscle. It was a messy, angry wound that required constant cleaning. This became Willa's world, the rhythm of the fever. She became the keeper of his body, with a bowl of warm water and a soft cloth provided by the tribal women. She bathed him. She wiped the sweat from his forehead, tracing the lines of worry that even sleep could not smooth away. She washed the grime of battle from his neck, his shoulders, his arms. It was an intimacy far deeper than the kiss by the river. That had been a spark. This was the slow, steady burn of devotion. She learned the map of him. She traced the old, jagged scar on his cheek, the white lines of knife marks on his forearms from years of trapping, and the newer, angrier red of the bullet wound. She saw him not as the invincible mountain man the town feared, but as a being of flesh and blood, vulnerable and broken. On the second night, the fever peaked. Boone tossed on the furs, muttering in a delirium. He spoke of fire, of falling rocks, of a woman standing in the water. Do not let her fall," he rasped, his hand gripping Willa's wrist with a bruising strength. "Willa." "I am here," Willa whispered, leaning over him. She pressed her cheek to his burning forehead, letting her tears mix with his sweat. "I am not falling. Boone, I am right here." He settled at her voice, his breathing hitching before smoothing out. Willa realized then that she was his anchor. Just as he had pulled her from the flood, she was now pulling him back from the dark edge of the void. The tribe watched this silent vigil. The elders, who had initially looked upon Willa with suspicion, the half-breed daughter who sold wood to the white invaders, now saw something else. They saw a woman who had cut the rope to save the river, They saw a woman who sat in the lodge of her ancestors, tending to a white man who had fought for their graves. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Boone opened his eyes, clear and blue as a winter sky. He looked at Willa, who had fallen asleep sitting up, her head resting on the edge of his pallet. He reached out, his hand trembling, and brushed a strand of black hair from her face. Willa woke instantly. She looked at him, and the relief that flooded her chest was so sharp it felt like pain. "You are back," she whispered. "It seems so," Boone croaked, his voice rough from disuse. He tried to shift, wincing as pain shot through his side. "Did we win?" "We won the battle," Willa said softly, dipping the cloth in cool water to wipe his face. "The war, that is being decided today." The war was indeed moving from the riverbank to the courtroom. Judge Thaddeus Black had arrived from the territorial capital 2 days prior, summoned by the urgent telegrams sent by Sheriff Dalton. The judge was a man of the old school, a federal appointee with a face like granite and a reputation for absolute, unyielding adherence to the law. He had set up a makeshift court in the town's meeting hall, a drafty wooden building that smelled of sawdust and floor wax. Willa had to leave Boone to testify. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, walking away from the lodge where he lay recovering. But Talon was waiting for her with 2 horses. "He will be safe," Talon assured her as he helped her mount. "My mother is watching him. She makes a soup that could wake the dead. He will be complaining about the taste by noon." Willa managed a weak smile. She looked at her cousin. Talon had washed off the war paint. He wore a clean buckskin shirt and trousers. He looked regal, a prince of a kingdom that was slowly being erased. Yet he held his head high. "They look at us differently now," Willa said as they rode down the trail toward the town. "They look at you differently," Talon corrected. "Before, you were the girl between worlds. Now, you are the bridge. A bridge gets walked on, Willa, but it connects things that would otherwise remain apart." The meeting hall was packed. Every miner, merchant, and homesteader in the valley had squeezed into the pews. Silas Crowder sat at the defendant's table, his arm in a sling, his face pale and drawn. He no longer looked like the master of the universe. He looked like a cornered rat in a silk vest. The trial was swift, brutal, and devoid of the theatricality Silas tried to employ. Silas's lawyer, a slick man from the East, tried to argue that the company had a federal mandate, that the savages and the squatter had incited a riot, and that Silas had fired in self-defense. Then Willa took the stand. She did not wear a fine dress. She wore her work clothes, clean but worn. She sat in the witness chair, her hands folded in her lap, and she told the truth. She spoke of the threats. She spoke of the night her cabin was burned. She spoke of the trees being cut on the high ridge and the mudslide that followed. She spoke of the river not as a resource, but as a neighbor. "Mr. Crowder calls it progress," Willa said, her voice ringing clear in the silent hall. "But there is no progress in burning a home. There is no progress in shooting a man who is standing with empty hands. He did not come to build, he came to take it. And when we would not give in, he tried to kill." The judge watched her over his spectacles, his expression unreadable. Then Talon took the stand. He spoke of the treaties signed 20 years ago, treaties that guaranteed the tribe's right to hunt and fish in the valley. He produced the original parchment, preserved in a leather tube, the signatures of the generals and the chiefs fading but legible. "This paper says we are friends of the Great Father," Talon said, holding it up. "Does the Great Father shoot his friends in the back?" The turning point came when Sheriff Dalton, under oath, admitted that Silas had ordered the firing of the first shot and that Boone Carver had been unarmed when he was gunned down. The verdict, when it came down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, fell like the gavel of God. "Silas Crowder," Judge Black intoned, standing tall behind the bench, "this court finds that your actions went far beyond the scope of your charter. You incited violence, committed arson by proxy, and attempted murder. The federal mandate for northern timber and rail in this valley is hereby suspended pending a congressional review." A murmur went through the crowd. Furthermore, the judge continued, you are to be remanded to the custody of the territorial marshals to await trial for the shooting of Boone Carver. Bail is denied. Silas stood up, his face purple with rage. This is a travesty. I'm a businessman. I bring civilization to this wilderness. Civilization, the judge said coldly, is the rule of law. Sir, not the rule of the gun. Take him away. As the deputies hauled a shouting Silas out of the hall, the judge turned his eyes to the back of the room, where Willa and Talon sat. There is one more matter, Judge Black said, shuffling his papers. The matter of Mr. Boone Carver. Willa held her breath. She knew Silas had brought up Boone's past the accident, the deaths of the surveyors years ago, trying to paint him as a villain. I have reviewed the files regarding the incident in the Bitterroot Range 3 years ago, the judge said. And I have read the testimony of the surviving crew members, which was conveniently suppressed by the company at the time. He looked at the empty defendant's chair. It appears that Mr. Carver repeatedly warned the site foreman about the instability of the shale. He was ordered, under threat of termination, to lead the team into the canyon. The rock slide was a tragic result of corporate negligence, not criminal intent by the guide. Willa felt tears prick her eyes. The warrant for Boone Carver is quashed, the judge declared. He is a free man, with the thanks of this court for preventing further bloodshed on this river. Case closed. The gavel banged. It was over. Willa walked out of the meeting hall into the blinding afternoon sun. The air tasted sweeter. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for weeks, the fear of the company, the fear for Boone's safety, the fear of her own displacement evaporated. She looked at Talon. The warrior nodded slowly. Justice, Talon said, tasting the word as if it were a strange fruit. It is a rare thing, cousin, but it is sweet. We need to tell Boone, Willa said. They rode back to the camp as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold. When they entered the lodge, Boone was sitting up, propped against a backrest of willow branches. He looked better. The color was returning to his face. Willa knelt beside him, taking his hand. It is done. Boone, Silas is in chains. The company is gone. Boone let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. And the dam? Suspended, Willa said. The judge upheld the treaty. The river runs free. She paused, squeezing his hand tighter. And you run free too. Boone, the judge cleared your name. The rock slide. He ruled it was an accident. You are not a wanted man anymore. Boone stared at her, his mouth opening slightly. He looked like a man who had been carrying a boulder on his back for 3 years and suddenly found it gone. He closed his eyes, and a single tear leaked out, tracking through the dust on his cheek. Free, he whispered. Free, Willa confirmed. In the days that followed, the valley began the slow process of healing. The company dismantled their equipment and left, leaving behind only the scars on the hillside as a reminder of their greed. The townspeople, eager to make amends, brought food and supplies to the tribal camp. They tipped their hats to Willa when they saw her, no longer seeing a river rat, but a woman of substance. 2 weeks later, Boone was strong enough to walk with a cane. He and Willa went down to the riverbank, to the spot where her cabin had stood. It was a scene of devastation. The charred logs lay in a heap. The chimney had collapsed into a pile of blackened stones. The mud from the slide had hardened into a crust over the garden patch her mother had tended. Willa stood in the center of the ruin, looking at the empty space where her life had been. I have the settlement money coming, she said quietly. The court ordered the company to pay damages for the arson, $500. That is a lot of money, Boone said, leaning heavily on his makeshift stick. You could go to St. Louis, buy a dress shop, live where the streets are paved. Willa looked at him. Is that what you would do? Go to the city? Boone shook his head. He looked at the mountains, at the river flowing silver in the sunlight. I am not made for pavement. Willa, I would wither and die in a month. I belong to the high lonesome. I do not want to be lonesome anymore, Willa said. She walked over to a patch of ash near where the front door had been. Something green caught her eye. She knelt down. Pushing through the black crust of the burnt earth were 3 small, bright green shoots. Fireweed, the first flower to return after a blaze. "Look," she said. Boone hobbled over and looked down. "Life is stubborn." "So am I," Willa said. She stood up and turned to face him. "I am not going to St. Louis. Boone, this is my land. My father is on the ridge. My mother is in the wind, and my heart." She touched his chest, right over his own beating heart. "My heart is right here." Boone covered her hand with his own. "You want to rebuild here in the flood path." "We will build higher," Willa said, pointing to a flat bench of land 50 yards up the slope, well above the high water mark. On solid rock, stone foundation, a big porch facing the river. "We?" Boone asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Unless you plan on giving my heart back." Willa challenged him, her eyes dancing, "which, as I recall, you are strictly forbidden to do." Boone laughed, a sound that was rusty but genuine. He pulled her close, ignoring the twinge in his side. "No returns. All sales final. I read the contract." "Good," Willa said. She rested her head on his shoulder, looking out at the river. "Then we have work to do." Mountain Man. A shadow fell over them. They turned to see Talon sitting on his horse at the edge of the clearing. He had a brace of pheasants hanging from his saddle and a look of amusement on his face. "I see the invalid is walking," Talon called out. "I thought I would have to carry you down the mountain like a sack of flour." "I am tough enough, bear chaser," Boone retorted, though there was no heat in it. Talon dismounted and walked over. He looked at the ruins, then at the 2 of them standing amidst the ashes. "The council is talking," Talon said. "They say the winter will be hard. They say a man with a hole in his side cannot cut logs alone. They say, maybe the warriors have some free time before the snow flies." Willa felt a lump form in her throat. "Talon, do not get sentimental. Cousin," Talon said, waving a hand. "We just want to make sure the new house is not as ugly as the last one." He looked at Boone, his dark eyes gleaming with mischief. "Besides, we have to look out for him. It is embarrassing for the tribe if our white brother gets eaten by a badger because he is too slow to run." "White brother," Boone raised an eyebrow. "Do not let it go to your head." Talon grinned. "You are still a mountain man who got himself tied up by the heartstrings of a wood-selling girl. It is a very undignified condition." Boone chuckled, clapping a hand on Talon's shoulder. "I will take it." Willa looked at the 2 men, the white hunter and the native warrior, standing together on the land that had once divided them. She looked at the green shoots in the ash. She looked at the river that flowed free and wild. The house was gone, yes, but the home was just beginning. "Come," Willa said, linking her arms with both of them. "Let us make a fire. I have fish to cook, and I am not charging anyone for the wood tonight." They walked together toward the riverbank, 3 survivors of the storm, ready to face the winter not as strangers, but as a family forged in fire and water. The sun set behind the peaks, casting a golden glow over the valley, promising that tomorrow, the work of rebuilding would begin. The seasons in Montana turned like the pages of a well-worn Bible, each one bringing a different kind of sermon. First came the winter, which had been hard and deep, burying the scars of the fire under 5 feet of snow. Then came the spring, violent with meltwater and mud, testing the resolve of every living thing in the valley. And now, it is autumn again. 1 full year had passed since the Battle of the River, as the locals had taken to calling it. The valley had changed, but it had not been broken. Upriver, miles away from the spot where Willa Hart's cabin had once stood, a small sawmill hummed. It was not the industrial monster Silas Crowder had envisioned. It was a modest operation, run by a cooperative of local men and overseen by the watchful eyes of the Salish Council. They cut only the trees marked by the Forestry Committee, avoiding the steep slopes and the sacred groves. The river, the Great Gallatin, flowed past it clear and cold, unchoked by dams, its song as wild and free as it had been 1,000 years ago. Willa Hart stood on the bank, watching the current. She looked different now. The oversized coat of her father was gone, replaced by a sturdy jacket of tanned elk hide that fit her frame. Her black hair was braided back, revealing a face that had lost the pinched look of desperate survival and gained the golden glow of a woman who knew her place in the world. She was no longer the solitary river girl who hid from the gaze of the town. She was a force. Down by the landing, 3 wagons were lined up. These were not customers bullying a lone girl for a cheap price. These were merchants from Bozeman, here to pick up the weekly shipment of firewood and cured lumber. "That is 2 cords of seasoned pine and 1 cord of birch," Willa told the lead driver, checking a ledger she held in her hand. "The birch is premium. It burns slowly and hot. Tell the hotel owner the price is $3. Firm." "Yes, ma'am," the driver said, tipping his hat. There was no leer in his eye, no mockery. He spoke to her with the deference one might show a banker or a sheriff. The town still called her the Virgin sometimes, in the hushed whispers of the saloon. But the word had shed its skin. It no longer meant a girl untouched by a man. It had come to mean something rarer in the West, a spirit that could not be touched by greed. She was the Virgin of the Valley because she was the only thing Silas Crowder's money could not buy. She remained whole, incorruptible, standing tall while others had bent their knees to the gold. Behind her, the sound of a hammer striking nails rang out, a rhythmic percussion that was the heartbeat of her new life. The new house stood on a rise of solid granite, 50 yards back from the river and well above the floodline. It was not a hovel. It was a home, built of thick, hand-hewn cedar logs. It was solid enough to withstand a blizzard and open enough to welcome the sun. A wide porch wrapped around the front, facing the water. On that porch sat 2 rocking chairs, crafted from bent willow wood. One was currently empty. The other was occupied by a calico cat that had wandered up from a farm and decided, as all sensible creatures did, that this was the safest place in the territory. Boone Carver was on the roof, nailing down the last of the cedar shakes. He moved with a slight stiffness in his left side. The bullet wound would always ache when the rain came, but his strength had returned. He wore a clean shirt, and his beard was trimmed close, revealing the strong line of his jaw. The wildness was still there in his blue eyes, but the haunted look of a man running from his ghosts had vanished. "Hey!" a voice called from the ground. Boone looked down to see Talon Bear River standing at the foot of the ladder, holding a bucket of pine tar. The warrior had become a fixture in their lives, as much a part of the household as the river itself. "You missed a spot," Talon criticized, pointing a finger at the eaves. "If the roof leaks, my cousin will make you sleep in the barn with the mules." "If the roof leaks," Boone called back, grinning, "it is because you mixed the tar too thin. Bear chaser." Talon laughed, a sound that came easily these days. The tension between the tribe and the white settlers had not disappeared entirely. Prejudice was a weed with deep roots, but in this valley, on this land, there was peace. Willa had forged it. She stood with 1 foot in the canoe and 1 foot on the shore, holding the 2 worlds together with sheer force of will. The wedding had happened 2 months ago, when the wildflowers were at their peak. It had not been a conventional affair. Willa had refused to choose between her bloodlines, so she had honored both. At sunrise, they stood by the river's edge. The tribal elders had come down from the high country. They wrapped Boone and Willa in a single buffalo robe, symbolizing that they were now one body, sharing one warmth. The shaman had brushed them with eagle feathers and smoked the pipe to the 4 directions, asking the spirits of the water and the mountain to guard their union. Boone, the white mountain man, had stood barefoot in the mud, speaking the vows in the Salish tongue that Talon had spent weeks teaching him. Then, at noon, they rode into town. They walked into the small wooden church, where Dr. Albright, Sheriff Dalton, and half the town sat in their Sunday best. The preacher, a man who usually railed against the sins of the frontier, had spoken gently that day. He blessed them in the name of the Christian God, acknowledging that love was the only true religion that could survive in the wilderness. It was a day that people still talked about, the day the river girl married the mountain man, and the whole valley stopped fighting long enough to celebrate. Back in the present, The sun began to dip toward the western peaks, casting long, golden shadows across the water. The wagon drivers paid Willa and rumbled away, leaving dust motes dancing in the light. Willa wiped her hands on her apron and walked up the path toward the house. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Boone, who was climbing down the ladder. "You are working late, Mr. Carver," she said. Boone dropped to the ground, dusting off his hands. He walked over to her, his gait slow but steady. He looked at her with a hunger that a year of marriage had not diminished. "I wanted to finish before the frost sets in tonight," Boone said. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. "A warm wife is a happy wife." "I am plenty warm," Willa said, leaning into his touch. Just then, a rider appeared on the road. It was a stranger, a man in a dusty coat riding a tired horse. He looked at the stack of wood remaining by the landing, then at the couple standing by the house. He pulled his horse up. "Excuse me, folks," the stranger called out. "I was told I could buy wood here. Is it for sale?" Willa straightened up. It was a question she had answered 1,000 times in her life. Since she was 12 years old, her answer had always been a transactional yes. But before she could speak, Boone stepped up behind her. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking at the stranger with a possessive glint in his eye. "You're still selling wood by the river, Mrs. Carver," Boone murmured in her ear, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. Willa smiled. She looked at the stranger, then turned her head to look at her husband. "Only to strangers," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet joy. "My heart is already sold." Boone chuckled, the sound warm and rich. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best bargain I ever made." He looked at the stranger. "Wood is $3 a cord. Take what you need and leave the money in the tin box by the gate." The stranger nodded, sensing he was intruding on something private and sacred. He went about his business, leaving them in their bubble of peace. "Talon is coming for supper," Boone said, not letting her go. "He says he is bringing venison." "He brings venison every time he wants to complain about your carpentry," Willa teased. "He is just jealous of my rocking chairs," Boone said, as if summoned by his name. Talon appeared from the tree line, walking up the path, but his face was serious today, lacking its usual teasing smirk. He carried a staff decorated with fresh feathers. "Cousin," Talon said, nodding to Willa. "Boone, what is it?" Willa asked, sensing the gravity in his tone. "Is it the council?" "The council has met," Talon said. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. "We have been talking about the maps. The white men call this the Gallatin. We had an old name for it, but it was a name of war." He looked at the river, which was turning a deep purple in the twilight. "The elders have decided to give it a new name," Talon announced. "In our tongue, it will now be known as Sentsex Galixw." Willa's eyes widened. She knew the words, "the water of the chosen heart." She translated softly. Talon nodded. To remember the woman who chose the land over the gold, and to remember the heart she gave to the mountain man to save it. Talon looked at Boone. "It is a great honor. Boone, usually. We name rivers after rocks or dead chiefs, naming it after a love story. That is new. It will make the young warriors soft." Boone felt a lump in his throat. He looked at the river, knowing that long after he and Willa were dust, the name would remain in the memory of the people. "Thank you," Boone said, his voice thick. "Do not thank me." Talon grunted. "Just cook the venison. I am starving." They went inside the new house. The interior was warm, lit by the glow of a cast-iron stove. The table was set for 3. There was laughter, the clinking of plates, and the easy camaraderie of people who had faced death together and chosen life. Outside, the darkness settled over the valley. The Wild West was a place of transaction. Men came to buy land. They came to buy gold. They came to buy the bodies of women and the souls of politicians. They bought rights to water and titles to mountains. It was a world where everything had a price tag, written in dollars or in blood. But Willa Hart and Boone Carver had proven that the most valuable things could not be bought. A heart that is free cannot be purchased. It can only be given. Willa had started as the virgin selling wood to survive, protecting herself with silence and an axe. Boone had started as the drifter, hiding his guilt in the high timber. They were two broken halves of a locket, useless apart, but when they snapped together, they held a picture of a future that Silas Crowder could never build with all his millions. The valley had a family. The tribe had a daughter who returned. And the river had a guardian. The camera of the mind pulls back now. Rising slowly above the roof of the cedar cabin, we see the chimney puffing white smoke into the crisp autumn air, a signal of warmth in the coming cold. We see the river, the water of the chosen heart, flowing silver and eternal, winding its way through the darkened pines. On the porch, the light from the window spills out. We see the silhouette of a man sitting on the steps, sharpening a hunting knife with a rhythmic shh sound. Beside him, a woman is stacking the last of the kindling for the night. They pause. He reaches out a hand. She takes it. They do not need to speak. And there, hanging on the outside wall of the cabin, illuminated by the lantern light, is a strange decoration. It is not a set of antlers or a rifle. It is a single, charred bundle of wood, blackened by fire, bound by a new rope. It hangs there as a monument, a reminder of the night the world tried to burn them down, and the fire that, instead of destroying them, forged them into something unbreakable. The wind whispers through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and cedar. The story of the virgin who sold wood but kept her soul fades into the vast, starlit silence of the American West. Thank you for listening to the story of Willa and Boone. I hope their journey from the cold riverbank to the warmth of their new home resonated with you. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Are you in the mountains, the city, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Do not forget to like the video and hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support helps me keep the spirit of the frontier alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart true.